What's up, biology students? Mr. Holloway here. In today's video, we're going to talk about another kind of organic molecule upon which all life depends. Today, we're going to talk about nucleic acids, the molecules that make up the universal genetic code of life. Like other organic molecules, nucleic acids are made up largely of carbon atoms. Carbon is a special kind of atom because it can form up to 4 covalent bonds with up to 4 additional atoms simultaneously. This allows carbon to form very large, very complex molecules, and this complexity is what allows carbon-based molecules to do so many important jobs for and inside of living organisms. In addition to being composed of carbon atoms, nucleic acids are also composed of hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus atoms. The function of nucleic acids is to store and transmit genetic information. This genetic information is said to be hereditary because it can be passed from one generation of living organisms to the next, meaning that this information can be inherited. This is why children look like their parents and why we can inherit certain traits, both good and bad, from our ancestors. That might mean that we inherit our mother's blue eyes or our father's curly hair. But it could also mean that we inherit our grandfather's predisposition for heart disease or our grandmother's thyroid disorder. Understanding the structure and function of nucleic acids can not only help us to understand why we look and act the way that we do, it can also help us to better understand how traits are passed from one generation to the next, and may one day lead to cures for diseases and disorders that are coded for in our genes, and for which there are currently no cures. In fact, genetics is one of the fastest growing fields of science, and we're making incredible discoveries about how nucleic acids affect our lives almost every day. Nucleic acids are composed of numerous monomers linked together to form a complex polymer. The monomers of a nucleic acid are molecules called nucleotides, and all nucleotides are fundamentally similar. Every nucleotide is composed of a nitrogenous base, a 5-carbon sugar, and a phosphate group, arranged as shown in this picture. These nucleotides bond together with other nucleotides to form long chains, polymers we call nucleic acids. There are 2 important kinds of nucleic acids, deoxyribonucleic acid, or DNA, and ribonucleic acid, or RNA. Here we can see a DNA molecule, which is one variety of nucleic acid. DNA is actually 2 long strands of nucleotides, each running in opposite directions and coiled around one another in a shape that we call a double helix. Here, where the double helix has been uncoiled, we can see the individual nucleotides that make up each strand of DNA. We can see that the phosphate group of one nucleotide bonds to the sugar portion of a different nucleotide, forming an alternating pattern of sugars and phosphates that we call the sugar-phosphate backbone. Nitrogenous bases stick out from this backbone like the steps on a ladder, and we can also see that the strands are held together in the middle because these nitrogenous bases form bonds with one another as well. All nucleotides are pretty much the same, except for the part that we call the nitrogenous base, and as it turns out, this is a really important piece. Both DNA and RNA each contain just 4 different kinds of nitrogenous bases, but not quite the same 4 bases. DNA nucleotides have a nitrogenous base made of either guanine, cytosine, adenine, or thymine, whereas RNA nucleotides have either guanine, cytosine, adenine, or uracil. We typically abbreviate these bases with just their first letter, so that would be G, C, A, or T in DNA, and G, C, A, and U in RNA. The bonds between these nitrogenous bases is what holds these 2 strands together, but there are certain rules that determine how this happens. For example, G can only form bonds with C. Likewise, A can only form bonds with T. These are called base pairs, and we can see those base pairing rules illustrated for us here in this picture. This picture also shows us why these base pairing rules exist. It has to do with certain bases having complementary shapes, meaning that these shapes fit together kind of like puzzle pieces, And just like puzzle pieces, two bases with shapes that are not complementary will not be able to fit together and form a bond. As it turns out, all living things have DNA that includes these same exact 4 nitrogenous bases. Think of this as the 4-letter alphabet that can be used to write out instructions necessary for building a living organism, just like we can put together the letters in our alphabet to form many different words and sentences, and use these to tell a nearly infinite number of stories. This is why we call it the universal genetic code, because all living organisms use the exact same code, made up of the exact same molecules. The only difference is the order and number of nucleotides contained in an organism's DNA. As a result, this makes it possible to take DNA out of one organism and put it into another organism in a process that we call genetic recombination. And it is possible only because all living organisms use the same genetic code made of the same basic molecules. This is actually how we manufacture human insulin to give to people with diabetes. We took the genes for making human insulin and put these genes into some bacteria. These bacteria read those genes and crank out insulin molecules that we can collect, refine, and give to humans as medicine. The rules of base pairing also make it possible for our DNA to make copies of itself. We started our existence as a single cell, and this single cell, called a zygote, contained all the DNA necessary to build a complete living organism. As that cell divides to form more cells, the DNA inside is able to replicate itself so that each new cell gets a full and complete copy of the DNA found in that original cell. Just like we have to consume carbohydrates in order to get the materials necessary to produce energy inside of our cells, we must also consume nucleotides from other living organisms in order to get the materials we need to build this new DNA. All our bodies need to do is take apart the DNA found in a hamburger or in a salad and reassemble those nucleotides to match our own DNA, using our DNA as a template. As we can see in this picture, by unzipping a molecule of DNA into 2 individual strands, new bases can be paired up with the old bases to form 2 new DNA molecules, each identical to the original because of the base pairing rules we just talked about, and each made of 1 original strand and 1 new strand. The ability of DNA to precisely replicate itself is what allows genetic information to be passed from one generation to the next, in much the same way that DNA is passed from one parent cell to each daughter cell during cell division. But mistakes do happen from time to time, and when these mistakes happen, they change the genetic code inside of our cells. We call these changes mutations. When a cell divides and DNA is passed from the original parent cell to each of the 2 new daughter cells, the DNA that is passed on is completely identical to the original set. This is the essence of asexual reproduction. During sexual reproduction, however, DNA from one organism is combined with the DNA from another organism to form a completely new combination of genes. To accomplish this, organisms that reproduce sexually use special cells called gametes. Some individuals make gametes called sperm, and other individuals make gametes that are called eggs. Unlike all of our other cells, which contain a full and complete set of DNA, gametes contain only a half set of DNA. This way, when a sperm cell that contains a half set of DNA combines with an egg cell that also contains a half set of DNA in a process that we call fertilization, the resulting cell, called a zygote, will contain a full and complete set of DNA. Half of the DNA inside of this zygote came from the parent who contributed the egg, and the other half came from the parent who contributed the sperm. This is why we look a little bit like each of our biological parents, but also look unique in our own way. This combination of our parents' DNA is then passed to every cell in our body as this zygote divides over and over again to make all of the trillions of cells found in the human body. And every one of these cells should have pretty much exactly the same set of DNA inside. In another one of my videos, you can learn a lot more about how this combination of our parents' DNA gives us our traits, and how certain molecules inside of our cells are able to read and interpret this universal genetic code in order to make that happen. But for now, hopefully you've got a good baseline understanding of what DNA is and why these nucleic acid molecules are necessary for life. And that's it for today. Thanks for watching, everyone.